In 1720, one man controlled more wealth than the entire French government. He was not a king, he was not a general. He was a Scottish gambler who had once escaped a death sentence. His name was John Law, and in the space of 4 years, he did something nobody had ever done before. He convinced an entire nation to abandon gold and trust paper instead. It worked, until the day it catastrophically didn't. And everything that happened after, every financial bubble, every bank run, every economic collapse in modern history, carries his fingerprints. Welcome to History Burns, where money, power, and history collide. Today, the man who accidentally invented the modern world and accidentally destroyed it at the same time. John Law was born in 1671 in Edinburgh, Scotland. His father was a goldsmith, a man who worked with money, stored money, and lent money. The business of finance was in the air Law breathed from birth. He was extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily reckless, two qualities that, in combination, produce either genius or catastrophe, and in Law's case, produced both simultaneously. By his early 20s, Law had moved to London and discovered two things that would define his life: mathematics and gambling. He was extraordinarily good at both. He understood probability in ways that most people around him simply could not, and he used that understanding to win consistently at cards, at dice, at every game available. But in April 1694, everything changed in a single moment. Law fought a duel with a man named Edward Wilson over a woman. Wilson died. Law was arrested, tried for murder, and sentenced to death. He escaped from prison before the sentence could be carried out. Nobody knows exactly how. The records are silent. One day, he was in a London jail. The next, he was gone. For the next 20 years, John Law wandered Europe. Amsterdam, Venice, Genoa, Paris. Gambling, studying, thinking, and developing a theory about money that would eventually shake the foundations of the Western world. He was not just gambling for money, he was observing. He watched how trade flowed, how credit expanded, how the Dutch had built an empire not on gold, but on paper promises backed by trust. And slowly, across 2 decades of exile, a radical idea began to take shape in his mind. Gold was not money. Gold was just a commodity that people had agreed to use as money. And that agreement could be replaced with something better. The idea sounds obvious today. We all carry paper money. We all use digital currency. But in 1700, this idea was so radical that most people who heard it thought Law was either a genius or a madman. They were not entirely wrong about either. He tried to sell the idea to Scotland first. They rejected it. He tried England. They rejected it. He tried Savoy. Rejected. Turin. Rejected. Every government in Europe looked at John Law's proposal and said the same thing. This is interesting. This is dangerous. And we want no part of it. Every government except one. France. A country so deep in debt, so close to financial collapse, that a dangerous idea suddenly looked like the only idea available. And here is where the story truly begins. Because what John Law was about to do in France was not just an economic experiment. It was a revolution in how human beings think about money itself. France in 1715 was a country on the edge of ruin. Louis XIV had just died, leaving behind 54 years of war, Versailles.
and a national debt so vast that the government could barely pay the interest on it. The new regent was Philippe d'Orléans, a smart, pragmatic man who understood that France needed something dramatic. Not another tax, not another war. Something genuinely new.
John Law walked into his court and made a proposal that should have sounded insane. Let me create a bank. Let me issue paper money backed not by gold, but by land, by trade, by the productive capacity of France itself. Philippe listened. Philippe thought. And Philippe said yes. In 1716, the Banque Générale opened its doors, the first central bank in French history. John Law, escaped murderer and professional gambler, was now running the French financial system. The bank began issuing banknotes, paper money redeemable for gold on demand. And something extraordinary happened. People used them. The economy began to move, trade expanded, tax revenues increased. It was working. Law understood something profound about money that most people still do not fully grasp. Money is not wealth. Money is a tool for moving wealth, and a better tool moves wealth faster, which creates more of it. Gold was heavy. Gold was slow. Gold could not be in Paris and Bordeaux simultaneously. Paper could. And paper, multiplied, could unlock economic activity that gold simply could not reach. Emboldened by success, Law proposed something even more ambitious. He would create a company, the Mississippi Company, with a monopoly on all French trade with North America. Louisiana was largely unexplored. Nobody really knew what was there, but Law described it with extraordinary vision: fertile land, endless resources, rivers of gold waiting to be discovered. He painted a picture so vivid that people could almost smell the opportunity. He was not lying. Not exactly. He genuinely believed in the potential of Louisiana, but he was doing something that every great financial bubble in history requires. He was asking people to pay today for profits that would arrive tomorrow. And tomorrow kept moving further away. In 1717, the Mississippi Company began selling shares to the public. The price started at 500 livres per share. Within 2 years, it would reach 10,000, a 20-fold increase. In 2 years, people who had never owned a financial asset in their lives were borrowing money to buy shares. Aristocrats, servants, priests, merchants. Everyone wanted a piece of what looked like the greatest wealth creation machine in human history. The street where shares were sold, the Rue Quincampoix in Paris, became so crowded that the government had to restrict access. People were paying enormous sums just to rent a window overlooking the street so they could watch the frenzy below. A new word entered the French language during this period: millionnaire. Millionaire. Because there were suddenly so many of them that a word was needed to describe them. John Law was at the center of all of it, the most powerful private individual in Europe. He controlled the French central bank. He controlled the Mississippi Company. He controlled the national debt. He was, effectively, the French economy. But here is the thing about being the most powerful man in the room. You are also the most exposed. And the experiment that John Law had set in motion was about to reveal a truth that no amount of genius could escape. At the absolute peak of the Mississippi bubble in 1719, John Law's personal wealth exceeded 6 billion livres. To put that in context, the entire annual tax revenue of France was around 150 million livres. Law was worth 40 times the French government's annual income.
People came from across Europe to participate in the Mississippi frenzy. English investors, Dutch investors, German princes. They flooded into Paris, desperate not to miss what looked like an unlimited opportunity. Law himself was aware that something dangerous was happening. The share price had risen far beyond any rational valuation. The company had real assets, but not 40 billion livres worth of real assets. The gap between price and value was growing every day. He tried to slow the speculation. He issued regulations limiting how much shares could rise per day. The market ignored him. When people believe in magic, regulations are just inconveniences.
And then the smart money started to leave. The Prince de Conti, one of the most powerful aristocrats in France, decided to cash out his shares and demanded payment in gold. He sent 3 wagons to the bank, 3 wagons full of banknotes, demanding they be exchanged for gold coins. The amount was so large it required 3 wagons just to carry the paper in. Law persuaded the regent to intervene. The prince was pressured into returning most of the gold, but the damage was done. The question that nobody wanted to ask had been asked. Did the bank actually have enough gold to back all the paper it had issued? The answer, which Law knew but could not say, was no. There was never enough gold. The entire system was built on confidence, on the belief that the paper represented something real. And belief, as Law was about to discover, is the most fragile foundation in the world. But before the collapse, there was one last moment of extraordinary ambition. Law proposed merging the Mississippi Company with the Banque Royale, converting the entire French national debt into company shares and effectively privatizing the French state under his management. For a brief moment in 1719, this actually happened.
One Scottish gambler, with no formal title, no army, no hereditary claim, controlled the finances of the largest kingdom in Europe. It was the most audacious financial takeover in history, and it lasted approximately 6 months. Because the thing about audacity is that it only works as long as nobody asks the one question you cannot answer. And in January 1720, somebody asked. The collapse of the Mississippi bubble did not happen suddenly. It happened the way all great collapses happen. Slowly at first, then all at once. In early 1720, a few large investors began quietly selling their shares. Not publicly, not dramatically. They simply converted paper into gold and moved the gold out of France. Discreetly, carefully, before anyone noticed. When others noticed the selling, they began to sell too. When more people sold, the price began to fall. When the price fell, more people panicked and sold. The self-reinforcing spiral of a collapsing bubble had begun.
Law tried everything. He banned the private ownership of gold. He made it illegal to hold more than 500 livres in coin. He tried to force people to use paper by making the alternative criminal. It did not work. You cannot legislate trust. When people have decided that paper is worthless, making it illegal to distrust the paper does not make them trust the paper. It makes them hide their gold and distrust the government as well.
By May 1720, the share price was in free fall. People who had been millionaires in December were bankrupt by June. Servants who had bought shares with borrowed money lost everything. The new middle class that the Mississippi bubble had briefly created was being wiped out. The crowds turned ugly. People gathered outside the bank demanding gold for their paper. When there was not enough gold, because there was never enough gold, the crowds became mobs. In one horrific incident, 15 people were crushed to death outside the bank. Not by soldiers, by other people. Desperate, panicking, pushing to get their money before it was gone. John Law watched his creation collapse from his office in Paris. He had believed in the system. He had genuinely believed that paper backed by productive capacity could replace gold. He was not a fraudster in the conventional sense. He was a visionary who had moved too fast for the world he was operating in.
In December 1720, with mobs in the streets and his bank in ruins, Law fled France. He left in disguise, in the middle of the night, with almost nothing. The man who had been worth 6 billion livres left Paris with a few hundred gold coins and the clothes on his back. Behind him, he left economic devastation on a scale France had never experienced. Fortunes wiped out. Businesses collapsed. The national debt, which Law had promised to eliminate, was larger than when he started. The word banque became so toxic in France that it would not be used in official financial contexts for over a century. John Law spent his final years wandering again, Brussels, Copenhagen, Venice, gambling to survive, trying to find another government willing to give him another chance. None did. He died in Venice in 1729, poor, forgotten, and far from home. He was 57 years old. The man who had briefly controlled the largest economy in Europe died with debts he could not pay and ideas that the world was not yet ready to understand. John Law died a failure. History initially agreed with that verdict. For over a century, he was remembered primarily as a cautionary tale, the gambler who destroyed French finance and fled in disgrace. But here is what history eventually had to admit. John Law was wrong about the timing. He was wrong about Louisiana. He was wrong about how fast trust could be built in paper money. But he was right about almost everything else.
Every country on Earth today uses paper money, or its digital equivalent, not backed by gold, backed by the productive capacity of the economy and the trust in the issuing government, exactly as Law proposed in 1716. The United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971. Every dollar in existence today is backed by exactly what John Law described. Not gold, but confidence. The full faith and credit of the United States government. Law's idea won. It just took 250 years. The Mississippi bubble also gave the world something else. The first modern stock market crash. And with it, the first systematic understanding of how financial bubbles form, grow, and collapse. Every subsequent bubble in history follows the same pattern that Law created and destroyed in France. The tulip mania of 1637, the South Sea bubble of 1720, the railway mania of the 1840s, the dot-com bubble of 2000, the housing bubble of 2008, the crypto bubbles of 2017 and 2021.
Different assets, same psychology, same mechanics, same ending. Every bubble follows John Law's script. A real innovation or opportunity. Prices rising faster than fundamentals justify. New participants drawn in by fear of missing out. Smart money quietly exiting. Collapse, blame, repeat. The mechanics have not changed in 300 years because the mechanics are not about markets. They are about human psychology, about greed, about the terror of watching other people get rich while you stand still. That psychology is as old as humanity itself. Law also invented, accidentally, the concept of the central bank as an institution separate from government. The idea that monetary policy should be managed by a specialized institution, not directly by politicians. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England in its modern form, all children of the Banque Royale. And here is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of the John Law legacy.
The thing he was most criticized for, printing more money than the gold supply could support, is something that every major central bank in the world does today, routinely, by design. Quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve creating trillions of dollars from nothing after 2008. The European Central Bank doing the same after 2012. The Bank of Japan doing it for 30 years. John Law's great crime, creating money unbacked by gold, is modern monetary policy, rebranded, institutionalized, taught in universities. The difference between John Law and the modern Federal Reserve is not the idea. The idea is identical. The difference is institutional trust, built over decades, regulated by law, monitored by markets. Law tried to build in 4 years what takes generations. He was not wrong. He was just 3 centuries early. Think about what that means for how we evaluate historical failures. The people we call failures are often simply people whose ideas arrived before the infrastructure needed to support them existed. Law needed 200 years of institutional development before his ideas could work. He had 4 years.
The Mississippi Bubble also had consequences that reached far beyond France. The collapse destroyed French confidence in financial innovation for generations, contributing directly to why France was slower than Britain to develop the banking and capital markets that would later fuel the Industrial Revolution. Britain had its own version of the Mississippi Bubble in the same year, the South Sea Company. It also collapsed, but Britain's financial institutions recovered faster, and the lesson Britain drew was different from France's. France concluded that paper money was dangerous. Britain concluded that paper money needed better regulation. That difference in conclusions, between avoidance and regulation, shaped the next century of history. Britain built the world's most sophisticated financial system. France did not. And when the Industrial Revolution arrived, capital flowed to where the financial infrastructure was strongest, to Britain, not France.
One man's 4-year experiment in Paris in 1716 contributed to reshaping the global balance of economic power for the next 2 centuries. Not because he succeeded, because he failed, and different countries drew different lessons from that failure. There is one final dimension of the John Law story that connects it to the present moment directly. The question of what money actually is, which Law was the first to seriously interrogate, has never been more actively debated than it is right now. Bitcoin was created in 2009 with an explicit rejection of Law's model, a fixed supply, no central bank, no government backing, pure mathematical scarcity instead of institutional trust. It was, in a sense, the anti-Mississippi Company, designed to be the opposite of everything Law had built. And yet Bitcoin created its own bubbles, rising and crashing in ways that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who watched shares trade on the Rue Quincampoix in 1719.
The technology changes. The human psychology does not. John Law's fundamental question, what should back the value of money, is the most important question in economics. And 300 years after he tried and failed to answer it, the world is still arguing about it. Central bankers, Bitcoiners, gold bugs, MMT economists. They are all, whether they know it or not, participants in a debate that Law started. The escaped murderer from Edinburgh, who wandered Europe for 20 years gambling and thinking, who talked his way into controlling the largest economy in the world, who created and destroyed the first modern financial bubble, who died poor in Venice with ideas that would eventually reshape every economy on Earth.
John Law was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was something rarer and more interesting. A man who was genuinely right about the future, but catastrophically wrong about the present. Every dollar in your pocket today is John Law's idea. Every central bank is his institution. Every financial bubble that has ever formed is his pattern. Every debate about whether money should be scarce or abundant is his question. He lost the battle. He won the war. Subscribe to History Burns, because this is exactly the kind of story that changes how you see the present. The money in your wallet. The interest rate your central bank just changed. The crypto bubble forming right now. All of it has roots in one gambler's idea, tested, destroyed, and quietly adopted by the entire world. The names change. The ideas don't. And if you don't understand where the ideas came from, you will always be surprised by what they produce.